"Do not look at me," the pregnant woman whispered without lifting her eyes, but the billionaire had already seen more than enough. Ethan Carter stood frozen beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Grand Regent Hotel, his leather briefcase slipping from his hand and striking the polished marble floor with a sharp echo that disappeared beneath the quiet melody drifting from the lobby piano. Around him, executives in tailored suits hurried toward private meetings while tourists admired the towering floral arrangements that filled the magnificent entrance with the fragrance of fresh lilies. None of them noticed the woman kneeling only a few yards away, carefully wiping away muddy footprints left by expensive shoes. Ethan could not breathe. The woman wearing the simple housekeeping uniform was Grace, his wife. She was 7 months pregnant with their first child. Every morning for nearly 3 months she had kissed him goodbye inside their Manhattan penthouse, smiling softly as she reminded him not to work too hard before disappearing for what she always called prenatal appointments, or quiet afternoons with friends. Ethan had believed every word because trust had always been the foundation of their marriage. Yet nothing in his world prepared him for the sight unfolding before him now. Grace slowly pushed the cleaning cart toward another section of the enormous lobby, her movements gentle and careful as she protected the life growing inside her. She looked tired, but there was no bitterness on her face. Instead, she greeted strangers with a warm smile that somehow made the cold luxury surrounding them feel unexpectedly human. Ethan instinctively stepped behind one of the towering marble columns before she could notice him. His heartbeat pounded louder than the music filling the elegant space. Questions crashed through his mind faster than he could answer them. Why would the woman who shared his fortune choose to clean hotel floors? Had she hidden financial troubles from him? Had someone threatened her? Had he failed to see something that had been happening directly in front of him all along? Before he could move, a sharply dressed hotel manager approached Grace with an expression that carried neither warmth nor gratitude. The manager pointed toward another corridor, speaking quickly while checking a tablet, and Grace simply nodded before carefully pushing her cart away without complaint. She never argued. She never defended herself. Watching her disappear through the golden hallway hurt Ethan more deeply than any business failure he had ever experienced. For years he had measured success through billion-dollar acquisitions, soaring stock prices, and towering buildings carrying his company name across the skyline. Yet at that moment every achievement felt strangely empty beside the quiet dignity of the woman he loved. Ethan picked up his briefcase with trembling hands and followed at a distance, determined to uncover the truth no matter how painful it might become, never imagining that the secret waiting beyond the employee corridors would force him to question not only his marriage, but the very man he believed himself to be. Grace disappeared through the employees-only corridor without once looking back, and Ethan waited several long seconds before quietly following, careful to remain far enough away that she would never suspect he was there. The elegant marble floors and sparkling chandeliers of the hotel lobby gradually gave way to narrow service hallways lined with supply closets, rolling laundry carts, and gray concrete walls that no guest would ever see. The cheerful piano music faded behind him, replaced by the distant hum of industrial washing machines and the steady rhythm of housekeeping staff beginning their afternoon assignments. Ethan had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts inside luxury hotels just like this one, yet he had never imagined the invisible world operating behind the polished public spaces. Employees hurried respectfully past one another carrying fresh linens, towels, cleaning supplies, and room service trays. Some greeted Grace with genuine warmth as she carefully guided her cart through the corridor. They smiled at her, asked how she was feeling, and reminded her to avoid lifting anything heavy. She thanked every person by name. Ethan noticed something unexpected. His wife was not treated like a stranger here. She belonged. Grace reached a small break room where several housekeepers gathered around an old coffee maker during their afternoon pause. Instead of sitting down to rest, she opened her lunch bag and quietly divided her homemade sandwiches into several smaller portions before offering them to 2 younger employees who looked embarrassed to accept. One woman hesitated, but Grace gently smiled and insisted. Ethan watched from around the corner, stunned by the effortless kindness that seemed completely natural to her. She had always been generous, but he had never realized how quietly she practiced it when nobody important was watching. Before anyone could finish eating, a sharply dressed supervisor entered the room holding a digital clipboard. His polished shoes clicked impatiently against the tile floor as every conversation immediately stopped. He quickly assigned additional rooms to the afternoon schedule and frowned when he reached Grace's name. Without raising his voice, he reminded her that several executive suites needed immediate attention before evening arrivals. Grace politely explained that her doctor had advised her not to spend too many continuous hours on her feet because of her pregnancy. The supervisor glanced briefly at her growing stomach before responding with a professional smile that carried very little compassion. He told her the hotel appreciated dedication and expected everyone to finish their assignments on time because luxury guests demanded perfection. Grace simply nodded. She did not argue. She quietly picked up her card again and continued down another hallway. Ethan felt an unfamiliar weight settle inside his chest. At home, he had surrounded Grace with every comfort money could provide. Their apartment overlooked Central Park. They employed private chefs, chauffeurs, and personal assistants whenever she wanted them. Yet here she willingly spent entire days polishing mirrors, changing bed linens, vacuuming carpets, and scrubbing bathrooms inside one of Manhattan's busiest luxury hotels. None of it made sense. His confusion only deepened when he watched her stop outside room 1824. Before entering, she gently placed one hand across her stomach and whispered something Ethan could not hear. Then she smiled softly, straightened her housekeeping apron, and knocked before beginning another ordinary task. Several minutes later, an elderly guest emerged from the room carrying a small bouquet of fresh flowers. Instead of walking away, the woman handed the flowers to Grace with grateful eyes and embraced her briefly before leaving the hallway. Grace accepted the unexpected gift with visible emotion, carefully placing the bouquet on top of her cleaning cart beside a folded envelope that appeared already worn from being opened many times. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Whatever mystery surrounded his wife had become even deeper. She was not simply cleaning hotel rooms. Invisible threads connected her to the people inside this building in ways he could not yet understand. As Grace pushed her cart toward the service elevator leading to the hotel's lower levels, Ethan quietly followed once again, unaware that every step was bringing him closer to a truth that would forever change how he measured wealth, success, and love. The service elevator doors closed with a quiet metallic sound, carrying Grace and several housekeeping employees toward the lower floors that most hotel guests never realized existed. Ethan hurried down the nearby staircase instead, determined not to lose sight of her while avoiding the risk of being recognized. By the time he reached the basement level, the atmosphere had changed completely. Gone were the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers that defined the Grand Regent Hotel. Here, exposed pipes stretched across the ceiling, rolling laundry bins lined the corridors, and the comforting aroma of expensive perfume had been replaced by the fresh scent of clean linen and detergent. Ethan slowed his pace as he watched Grace carefully organize stacks of folded towels before helping another employee push an overloaded laundry cart through a narrow hallway. Even while carrying out ordinary tasks, she constantly checked on everyone around her. She offered a bottle of water to an elderly maintenance worker, adjusted a younger employee's heavy cart so it rolled more easily, and paused to encourage a nervous new housekeeper who struggled to memorize room assignments. No one seemed surprised by her kindness. Instead, they responded as though this had become part of their daily routine. One middle-aged employee smiled and quietly said, "You always take care of everybody else before yourself." Grace answered with the same gentle smile Ethan knew so well. "We all carry something that nobody else can see," she replied. "A little kindness makes the load lighter." Ethan stood hidden behind a service doorway, feeling those simple words settle heavily inside him. He had built an empire by solving complicated financial problems, yet Grace seemed to understand something far more valuable with remarkable simplicity. Minutes later, she collected fresh supplies and entered another executive suite scheduled for departure cleaning. Ethan remained outside, watching through the slightly open doorway as she worked with extraordinary attention to detail. She straightened every pillow, polished every mirror until it reflected the afternoon sunlight like glass, carefully folded fresh towels, and even arranged a small children's stuffed rabbit that had accidentally fallen beneath the bed. Before leaving, she placed the forgotten toy neatly beside the guest's packed suitcase so it would not be left behind. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible, yet somehow deeply meaningful. As Grace prepared to leave the room, the same hotel supervisor appeared once again. He glanced at his tablet before inspecting the room with quick, critical eyes. Although everything looked immaculate, he pointed toward a barely noticeable fingerprint on the bathroom mirror and calmly instructed Grace to repeat the entire inspection process because luxury standards allowed no mistakes. Ethan expected his wife to defend herself. Instead, she quietly thanked the supervisor for noticing the detail, and immediately began cleaning the mirror again without a trace of resentment. The supervisor walked away satisfied, never realizing that the woman he had just corrected was married to one of the wealthiest businessmen in New York. Ethan felt a growing discomfort. He could not explain. It was not anger alone. It was shame. For years he had believed that providing financial security automatically meant protecting the people he loved. Yet somewhere along the way he had stopped paying attention to the quiet parts of Grace's life, the places where money could never replace presence, understanding, or trust. His thoughts were interrupted when a young bell attendant rushed into a hallway carrying a small paper bag. "Grace," he called softly. "The family from room 1220 asked me to give this to you before they checked out." Grace accepted the bag with visible surprise. Inside rested several handwritten thank you notes, tied together with a pale blue ribbon and a tiny pair of knitted baby socks. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, but she quickly composed herself before anyone else noticed. She carefully tucked the notes into the worn envelope Ethan had already seen resting on her cleaning cart. The bell attendant smiled warmly. "They said they will never forget what you did for them." Grace gently shook her head. "Please tell them to focus on their little girl. That is all the thanks I need." Ethan stared at the envelope as questions multiplied faster than answers. Who were these families? Why did complete strangers leave heartfelt letters for his wife? What had she done that inspired such gratitude while working as an ordinary housekeeper? As Grace quietly pushed her cart toward another restricted hallway marked employees only, Ethan followed once more, unaware that the hidden corridor ahead protected the secret that had quietly connected her heart to dozens of lives long before he had ever begun searching for the truth. Grace disappeared through the restricted hallway until she reached an old metal door marked Staff Wellness Center, a place hidden behind the hotel's busy operations that no guest would ever notice. Ethan slowed his steps and remained just far enough away to avoid being seen. Through the narrow window in the door, he watched something that made even less sense than everything he had witnessed that afternoon. Instead of storing cleaning supplies or taking a well-deserved break, Grace carefully removed her housekeeping gloves, washed her hands, and entered a modest room where several hotel employees and their children quietly waited together. A young mother held the hand of a little boy wrapped in a warm blanket. An elderly janitor sat beside his daughter while reviewing medical papers. Two exhausted parents gently rocked an infant sleeping inside a stroller. The atmosphere carried neither despair nor celebration. It felt like a place where ordinary people gathered simply to help one another survive difficult seasons. Grace greeted every family by name, as though they had known each other for years. She knelt beside the little boy first and smiled as she handed him a children's puzzle from a small wooden cabinet. His face immediately brightened. She asked about his latest hospital visit, listened carefully to every answer, and quietly congratulated him for being brave. She then crossed the room to comfort the young mother, placing one reassuring hand over hers while speaking so softly that Ethan could not hear the words. Whatever Grace said brought visible relief to the woman's face. Before long, several volunteers entered carrying boxes filled with diapers, canned food, blankets, and children's books. Grace opened a notebook resting on the corner of a folding table and began organizing every donation with remarkable precision. She carefully checked names, addresses, and supply lists, making certain each family received exactly what they needed. No one gave orders. No one sought recognition. Everyone simply worked together with quiet purpose. Ethan noticed a familiar pale blue ribbon once again as Grace gently untied the growing collection of handwritten letters inside the worn envelope. She added another thank you note from the paper bag she had received upstairs before placing everything neatly back into the folder. Those letters were clearly important to her, yet she handled them with humility rather than pride. A few moments later, the hotel supervisor entered the room unexpectedly. Ethan instinctively prepared for another uncomfortable exchange, but instead the supervisor looked genuinely surprised to find Grace still there after finishing her assigned rooms. He reminded her that her shift had officially ended nearly 30 minutes earlier and suggested that she should go home to rest because of her pregnancy. Grace smiled appreciatively but quietly replied that several families were expecting tonight's supplies before morning hospital appointments. She assured him she would leave as soon as every package was ready. The supervisor hesitated for a moment before silently helping carry several heavy boxes toward the storage shelves. Ethan watched in disbelief. The same manager who appeared so demanding upstairs now worked beside Grace without complaint. It became painfully clear that the woman his wife had become inside these walls possessed a quiet influence that could soften even the busiest people. As the evening continued, a little girl no older than 8 approached Grace holding a folded sheet of paper decorated with colored crayons. She shyly handed it to her before wrapping both arms around Grace's waist with extraordinary affection. Grace unfolded the drawing and smiled through tears. It showed a simple picture of a mother, a father, and a baby standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in careful uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for giving my family hope." Grace gently kissed the child's forehead and whispered, "Promise me you will keep dreaming." Ethan felt his own eyes begin to sting. He still did not understand why his wife had chosen this hidden life, but he could no longer believe she was hiding something selfish. Whatever secret she carried had been built from compassion instead of deception. As Grace finished arranging the final care packages, she carefully locked the notebook inside a small cabinet before switching off the lights. Ethan quietly stepped back into the shadows as she walked toward the parking garage, completely unaware that the answers he desperately sought were now resting inside that modest notebook, waiting for someone brave enough to open its pages. Grace drove away from the hotel just after sunset in an aging compact sedan that looked completely out of place among the luxury vehicles leaving the underground parking garage. Ethan remained several car lengths behind in his black executive sedan, careful not to lose sight of her while making certain she would never recognize his vehicle in the evening traffic. Instead of driving toward their Manhattan penthouse, Grace crossed the East River and continued into a quiet working-class neighborhood where old brick apartment buildings stood beside neighborhood grocery stores, family-owned laundromats, and small diners glowing beneath faded neon signs. Ethan had never visited this part of the city. His business meetings, charity galas, and investment conferences had always taken place in a different New York, one surrounded by polished glass towers and private elevators. Grace finally parked beside a modest community center connected to a neighborhood church. The building was old but carefully maintained. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance, and colorful drawings made by children filled the windows. Ethan remained inside his car as he watched Grace carry several boxes from her trunk. Moments later, volunteers rushed outside to help her. Nobody greeted her as an employee. They welcomed her like family. One elderly woman embraced Grace with obvious affection before gently touching her shoulder and asking about the baby. Grace smiled warmly and assured everyone that both she and the child were healthy. Ethan quietly left his car and moved closer, remaining hidden behind a row of maple trees bordering the parking lot. Through the brightly lit windows, he watched the rooms slowly fill with families. Children laughed while completing homework around folding tables. Volunteers served homemade soup from large stainless steel pots. Parents reviewed paperwork with counselors sitting nearby. Grace immediately joined them, opening the same notebook Ethan had seen earlier inside the hotel. She carefully compared names, checked supply requests, and quietly organized envelopes that appeared to contain grocery gift cards and pharmacy vouchers. Every movement reflected experience rather than improvisation. This was clearly not her first evening here. As the hours passed, Ethan noticed something even more surprising. Several hotel employees arrived after finishing their shifts. The elderly maintenance worker, the young bell attendant, and even the demanding hotel supervisor entered carrying additional boxes filled with donated blankets, canned food, baby formula, and children's books. Together they unloaded every package without seeking attention or recognition. Grace thanked each volunteer personally before directing the supplies toward different waiting families. There was no confusion because everyone naturally looked to her for guidance. She had become the quiet center holding the entire operation together. While helping arrange winter coats by size, Grace paused to speak with a father whose little daughter sat beside him drawing pictures with colored pencils. The man lowered his head as though embarrassed, but Grace gently placed one reassuring hand over his shoulder before handing him an envelope. He looked inside, covered his mouth with trembling fingers, and whispered, "I do not know how to repay this." Grace answered softly, "When your family is back on its feet, help someone else. That is enough." Ethan felt those words settle deeply inside him. They sounded nothing like the speeches delivered at expensive charity banquets, where generous donations often arrived accompanied by cameras and applause. Here there were no reporters, no corporate logos, and no polished presentations. Only ordinary people quietly helping one another carry impossible burdens. Near the back of the room, a bulletin board displayed photographs of dozens of families standing beside handwritten thank you letters. Ethan recognized the same pale blue ribbon holding similar notes inside Grace's worn envelope. Every letter represented a life she had touched without ever mentioning it at home. He suddenly realized how little he truly knew about the woman he loved. His attention shifted when Grace unlocked a small wooden cabinet and carefully placed the notebook inside before sliding a single manila folder beneath it. The folder carried no label except a simple handwritten date from several months earlier. Before closing the cabinet, Grace rested her hand briefly upon the folder and closed her eyes as though silently making a promise. Then she locked the cabinet, slipped the key into her pocket, and prepared to leave for the night. Ethan remained hidden in the darkness, unable to shake the feeling that whatever rested inside that plain folder connected every unanswered question together, and for the first time since stepping inside the Grand Regent Hotel, he wondered whether the greatest secret was not what Grace had hidden from him, but what his own successful world had unknowingly taken away from the people she had quietly devoted herself to protecting. Grace arrived home nearly 2 hours after Ethan, quietly placing her worn canvas bag beside the kitchen island before slipping off her shoes with the same gentle care she had shown throughout the day. Ethan had already changed into a casual sweater and sat alone in the living room, pretending to review business reports on his tablet even though he had not read a single page. Every few moments he glanced toward the hallway, searching Grace's face for any sign that she knew he had followed her. She smiled exactly as she always did. She asked whether his meeting had gone well, whether he had eaten dinner, and whether the baby's nursery furniture had been delivered as scheduled. Her voice carried warmth instead of suspicion. Ethan answered each question almost automatically, hiding the storm inside his thoughts. He wanted to ask why she had spent the entire day cleaning hotel rooms. He wanted to ask about the hidden wellness center, the neighborhood community building, the grateful families, the notebook, and the locked cabinet. Yet every question remained trapped behind his silence because he realized he had earned none of those answers honestly. He had invaded the privacy of the woman who trusted him most. Grace prepared a simple cup of herbal tea before sitting beside the large window overlooking the sparkling Manhattan skyline. One hand rested naturally across her growing stomach as she watched snowflakes drift between the surrounding skyscrapers. Ethan noticed how exhausted she looked. Tiny signs that had escaped him for months suddenly became impossible to ignore. Her shoulders moved carefully whenever she changed position. Her hands carried faint dryness from constant cleaning products despite the lotion she quietly applied each evening. Even the comfortable shoes she wore around their apartment showed more wear than he remembered. Somehow, while building one of the nation's fastest-growing companies, he had failed to notice the quiet sacrifices unfolding inside his own home. After Grace went upstairs to rest, Ethan remained awake in his private study long after midnight. Instead of opening financial reports, he logged into the secure internal network of Carter Holdings and searched the company's archived records. At first he found nothing connected to the Grand Regent Hotel beyond ordinary investment summaries. Then he expanded his search to include charitable partnerships, employee assistance programs, and community grants from the previous year. Hundreds of documents appeared across the screen. Most contained routine approvals carrying digital signatures from senior executives rather than Ethan himself. As he continued reading, one file captured his attention. 8 months earlier, Carter Holdings had completed a sweeping corporate restructuring designed to reduce administrative spending across dozens of subsidiaries and partner organizations. The report praised its efficiency, noting millions of dollars in projected annual savings. Buried deep within dozens of pages appeared a brief paragraph describing the discontinuation of several small community support initiatives considered financially non-essential. Ethan frowned. The language sounded familiar. He opened the appendix attached to the report and slowly scanned a list of cancelled programs. Near the bottom appeared a name that made his pulse quicken: the Grand Regent Employee Family Support Fund. According to the summary, the program had once provided temporary assistance for hotel employees facing medical emergencies, unexpected family hardships, housing instability, and children's health expenses. Because participation numbers appeared relatively small, analysts had recommended ending corporate sponsorship and reallocating the funds toward higher return initiatives. The recommendation had been approved automatically during the restructuring process. Ethan leaned back in stunned silence. He could not remember ever reading that page. Like hundreds of similar reports, it had likely been reviewed by committees before reaching his electronic approval queue alongside countless other corporate decisions. One digital signature. One routine approval completed in less than a minute. Yet today he had watched families receiving food, diapers, blankets, pharmacy vouchers, and hope from the very program that should no longer have existed. Grace had somehow kept it alive. Ethan closed his eyes as painful realizations slowly settled over him. He still did not know exactly how she had done it, or why she had chosen to carry the burden alone, but one truth had become impossible to deny. The mystery he had been chasing was beginning to point not toward Grace's hidden life, but toward a forgotten decision made inside his own company, a decision that may have quietly changed hundreds of lives before he had ever noticed its consequences. The following morning Ethan arrived at Carter Holdings before sunrise, long before the executive floor filled with assistants carrying coffee and investors waiting for presentations. The city beyond his office windows slowly emerged beneath a pale winter sky, but for the first time in years the skyline failed to inspire him. His thoughts remained fixed on the families he had quietly watched the previous evening and the forgotten corporate reports still open on his computer. He requested every document connected to the discontinued Employee Family Support Fund, including emails, meeting notes, financial recommendations, and approval histories. Within an hour several senior executives gathered around the polished conference table, expecting another discussion about quarterly earnings. Instead, Ethan placed a single printed report in the center of the table and calmly asked one question. Who decided these families were no longer worth helping? The room fell silent. Finally, the chief financial officer explained that the restructuring committee had followed standard performance metrics. The assistance program served relatively few employees compared with larger charitable initiatives, making it difficult to justify continued corporate funding. The recommendation had been reviewed through normal procedures and ultimately approved electronically. Ethan looked down at the familiar digital signature carrying his own name. Although he had not personally written the recommendation, he had authorized it without asking what would happen after the funding disappeared. The realization settled over him like an unbearable weight. He dismissed the meeting early, ignoring the confused expressions surrounding the table, then quietly instructed his executive assistant to cancel every remaining appointment. There was only one place he needed to be. By late afternoon Ethan returned to the Grand Regent Hotel, but this time he did not enter through the grand revolving doors reserved for guests. Instead, he walked through the employee entrance at the rear of the building. Housekeepers, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, and bell attendants looked at him with polite curiosity, recognizing the successful businessman from magazine covers without understanding why he had appeared in their hallway. Ethan continued until he reached the familiar staff wellness center. The room looked exactly as it had the previous evening. Families sat together reviewing paperwork, volunteers sorted donated supplies, and children quietly colored pictures around folding tables. Grace stood beside the storage cabinet, carefully checking inventory inside her notebook. Before Ethan could step forward, a middle-aged woman approached Grace carrying a young boy bundled in a winter coat. The child immediately smiled when he saw her. His mother explained that the hospital had finally approved his next round of treatment because transportation vouchers from the support program allowed them to attend every appointment. Grace embraced them warmly and quietly celebrated their good news as though it were her own family's blessing. Ethan remained frozen just outside the doorway. Another elderly hotel employee approached Grace holding a small loaf of homemade bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. He insisted she take it home because she needed proper meals during her pregnancy. Grace laughed softly before accepting. Only half, gently returning the other half to him because she knew he lived alone. Everywhere Ethan looked, gratitude flowed toward his wife in ways that money could never purchase. There were no plaques bearing her name, no speeches praising her generosity, and no photographers documenting her kindness. There were only ordinary people whose lives had been quietly strengthened because she had refused to let them face hardship alone. Then Ethan noticed something that stole his breath. Resting on a nearby bulletin board hung an old framed certificate recognizing the original founding sponsors of the Employee Family Support Fund. At the bottom of the list appeared Carter Holdings. Someone had carefully covered the company logo with a simple paper heart drawn by a child in bright red crayon. Ethan stared at the tiny heart for several long moments before understanding its silent message. The children did not remember corporate sponsors or financial restructuring committees. They remembered the person who showed up every week with groceries, blankets, encouragement, and hope. In their eyes, Grace had become the true face of compassion. As she closed the notebook and gently rested one hand across her growing stomach, Ethan realized he could no longer remain hidden in the shadows. The truth had become too large to observe from a distance, and the conversation that would change both of their lives was now only a few steps away. Bien tapped. Grace finally looked toward the doorway, and the gentle smile she had been offering every family slowly disappeared when she saw Ethan standing there. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The cheerful conversations inside the wellness center continued around them, but it felt as though the entire room had faded into silence. Grace lowered her notebook onto the folding table and quietly walked toward him. Her eyes searched his face before she asked in a calm voice, "How long have you known?" Ethan struggled to answer. Every carefully prepared explanation vanished beneath the weight of regret pressing against his heart. "Since yesterday afternoon," he admitted honestly. "I saw you at the hotel. I followed you. I should have trusted you enough to ask instead." Grace closed her eyes briefly, not in anger but in disappointment. She took a slow breath before looking back at him. "I never wanted you to find out like this." Ethan glanced around the room where volunteers continued sorting blankets and grocery bags while children laughed over board games in the corner. "Then help me understand," he said softly. "Please." Grace led him toward two empty chairs beside the window. Snow drifted quietly outside while warm lights filled the modest room. She rested one hand across her stomach before speaking. "Do you remember the restructuring your company announced 8 months ago?" Ethan nodded without saying a word. "The Employee Family Support Fund disappeared overnight." She continued. "Most people believed it was only another budget adjustment. On paper it probably looked small. But here, that money paid for prescriptions, transportation to children's hospitals, temporary rent assistance, groceries, diapers, and emergency utility bills. Families who had nowhere else to turn suddenly had nothing." Ethan lowered his eyes. Every sentence landed like another reminder of how easily numbers inside a financial report could become real lives outside a conference room. Grace reached into her canvas bag and carefully removed the worn manila folder Ethan had seen locked inside the cabinet. She placed it gently between them before opening it. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters, hospital appointment cards, grocery receipts, volunteer schedules, and photographs of smiling families. When the paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hands as he began reading the carefully written letter. The handwriting was uneven, as though every sentence had been written during moments stolen between hospital visits and sleepless nights. To the person who refused to let my family disappear, it began. You never asked who deserved help. You only asked what our daughter needed. When my husband lost his job after taking too many days away from work to sit beside our little girl in the children's hospital, we believed everything was ending at once. The bills kept arriving. The rent became impossible. We stopped answering the telephone because every call brought another reminder that we could not pay. Then someone at the hotel told us about a woman named Grace who said no family should ever have to choose between buying medicine and buying dinner. You brought groceries without making us feel ashamed. You arranged transportation when our car broke down. You stayed with our daughter while I met doctors because you said every mother deserves someone standing beside her. One day she asked why a stranger cared so much about us. I told her that sometimes God answers prayers by sending ordinary people with extraordinary hearts. Ethan slowly lowered the letter, unable to continue for several moments. His vision blurred as he looked across the room at the smiling little girl he had seen drawing pictures earlier that evening. She was alive, laughing, and happily coloring another page while her parents quietly spoke with volunteers nearby. Grace watched Ethan without saying anything. She knew the letter was speaking far louder than she ever could. After collecting himself, Ethan carefully reached for another envelope resting inside the folder. This letter came from an elderly maintenance worker employed by the hotel for more than 25 years. He described suffering a serious medical emergency while caring for his wife, whose memory had slowly faded because of illness. When the support fund disappeared, he believed retirement would force them from their apartment. Grace and the volunteer team quietly arranged temporary assistance, coordinated meal deliveries, and ensured he could continue receiving treatment without losing hope. Another letter came from the young Bell attendant Ethan had already met. His younger brother required ongoing physical therapy after a devastating accident, and transportation assistance provided through the volunteer program allowed the family to keep every appointment. Each story revealed another quiet miracle accomplished without publicity, recognition, or expectation of reward. Ethan finally closed the folder and looked directly at Grace. I spent years believing generosity meant writing larger checks than everyone else, he admitted softly. But you gave these families something I never even thought about. Grace tilted her head gently. Presence, she answered. People remember who sat beside them when life became frightening. Money matters, but it cannot replace showing up. Before Ethan could respond, several volunteers gathered near the entrance as the hotel's supervisor entered carrying another stack of donation boxes. He immediately noticed Ethan standing beside Grace and looked visibly uncomfortable. For a brief moment he seemed worried that a wealthy executive might question the program operating quietly behind the scenes. Instead, Ethan walked forward, extended his hand, and thanked him for continuing to help after long workdays. The supervisor appeared genuinely surprised. Grace is the reason we never stopped, he replied honestly. After the company funding disappeared, many of us assumed everything would close. She told us that if even one child still needed help, then quitting was not an option. Ethan looked back at Grace with growing admiration. The woman he had married had never blamed him, never exposed his company's mistake, and never demanded recognition for carrying a burden that should never have rested on her shoulders. She had simply continued serving others because they needed someone to remain faithful when the system had quietly failed them. As volunteers finished organizing the final care packages for the evening, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would not repair this tragedy with a single donation or a carefully worded public statement. He would begin by accepting responsibility for every forgotten family hidden behind those old financial reports. Only then could he hope to become the husband Grace already believed he was capable of being, and only then would their child inherit not merely a successful business, but a legacy built upon compassion instead of convenience. The next morning, the executive conference room inside Carter Holdings looked exactly as it always had. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the Manhattan skyline, polished walnut tables gleamed beneath soft lighting, and digital screens displayed charts predicting another record-breaking quarter. Yet, the atmosphere felt entirely different because Ethan no longer saw numbers alone. Every graph reminded him of the handwritten letters resting inside Grace's worn folder. Every percentage represented people whose lives could quietly change because of decisions made inside this room. As senior executives settled into their seats expecting another discussion about growth projections, Ethan remained standing at the head of the table with unusual calm. Instead of opening the financial presentation prepared by his staff, he placed Grace's folder gently on the conference table. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. The chief financial officer politely asked whether there had been a change in the meeting agenda. Ethan nodded. "There has been a change," he replied. "Not only in today's agenda, but in the way this company will make decisions from this day forward." The room became completely silent. Ethan opened the folder and slowly removed several handwritten letters. Without mentioning names, he read portions describing parents choosing between paying rent and buying medicine, employees struggling to reach children's hospital appointments, and families who had quietly survived because volunteers refused to abandon them after corporate funding disappeared. When he finished reading, nobody spoke for several long moments. The words carried more weight than any financial forecasts projected onto the conference room screens. Finally, the chief operating officer carefully explained that the restructuring had followed accepted business standards and that every recommendation had been supported by measurable data. Ethan listened respectfully before answering in a steady voice. "I am not questioning the mathematics. I am questioning what our mathematics failed to measure." He walked toward the large screen and displayed the familiar report authorizing the cancellation of the Employee Family Support Fund. "This document saved money," he continued, "but it also transferred the burden onto people who had already exhausted every resource they possessed. We celebrated efficiency while families quietly carried the cost." Several executives lowered their eyes. No one attempted to argue. Ethan then announced a series of immediate changes. The Employee Family Support Fund would be fully restored before the end of the day with permanent long-term financing protected from future restructuring reviews. Emergency medical assistance, transportation support, temporary housing relief, and family care services would expand beyond the Grand Regent Hotel to every hospitality property operated through Carter Holdings across the United States. More importantly, every future restructuring proposal affecting employee well-being would require direct executive review supported not only by financial analysis but also by documented human impact assessments. The room remained silent until the chief financial officer finally asked whether shareholders might question the additional expense. Ethan smiled gently, remembering Grace's quiet words from the previous evening. "If our success depends upon ignoring people who trusted us," he answered, "then we have misunderstood success from the beginning." By that afternoon, the restored program had already been approved unanimously by the board after Ethan personally accepted responsibility for the earlier decision. He refused to blame committees, consultants, or automated approval systems. The signature had carried his name, and therefore the responsibility belonged to him as well. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the neighborhood community center carrying no photographers, no reporters, and no corporate announcement. He simply walked through the familiar doorway where volunteers continued preparing care packages exactly as they had every week before. Grace looked up in quiet surprise as Ethan approached the folding table. Without speaking, he placed the newly signed restoration documents beside her notebook. Grace carefully read the first page, then looked back at him with tears quietly filling her eyes. Ethan gently took her hand and said, "You spent months repairing the consequences of one decision that I approved without understanding its cost. I cannot change the past, but I can make certain no family is ever forgotten that way again." Around them, volunteers gradually realized what had happened. Smiles spread across the room, not because a wealthy businessman had arrived, but because hope that had survived through sacrifice would finally be carried forward by lasting change instead of temporary rescue. At that moment, Ethan understood that the greatest victory of his career would never appear on a balance sheet, because it had begun with the courage of one quiet woman who believed every life deserved to be seen. 3 weeks later, the community center looked brighter than Ethan had ever seen it. Fresh evergreen wreaths decorated the entrance, children's artwork covered the walls, and the familiar folding tables had been transformed into long banquet tables filled with homemade casseroles, warm bread, fresh fruit, and desserts prepared by dozens of volunteers. The restored Employee Family Support Fund had already begun reaching every Carter Holdings hospitality property across the country, but no one had gathered that evening to celebrate a corporate decision. They had come to celebrate the people who had quietly carried hope through the months when no official support remained. Grace moved slowly through the room with one hand resting gently beneath her growing stomach, while volunteers insisted on carrying every heavy tray for her. She greeted each family exactly as she always had, asking about medical appointments, new jobs, children's report cards, and grandparents recovering from surgery. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Grace remembered every name, every story, every small victory, and every difficult season. She had never treated kindness like a project. She had treated it like a relationship. As the evening meal ended, the elderly maintenance worker quietly tapped a spoon against his coffee cup. The conversations gradually faded until every eye turned toward the front of the room. He smiled warmly before inviting Grace to stand beside him. She immediately shook her head, trying to remain seated, but the entire room responded with gentle applause until she reluctantly walked forward. Ethan joined her, standing slightly behind because he believed this moment belonged entirely to her. One by one, families approached carrying small gifts that could never have been purchased inside expensive stores. A little girl presented Grace with a framed drawing showing volunteers standing beneath a bright blue sky while children played safely nearby. A young father handed her a hand-carved wooden angel made during evenings after work. An elderly grandmother offered a carefully knitted baby blanket stitched with tiny white stars for the child Grace would soon welcome into the world. Every gift carried countless hours of love rather than financial value. Then the mother whose daughter had written the first letter Ethan read stepped forward holding a simple glass jar filled with folded pieces of colored paper. She explained that every family had written one sentence describing how Grace had changed their lives. Grace slowly opened the jar and unfolded the first note. "You reminded us that asking for help is not the same as giving up." Another read, "My son smiles again because you believed tomorrow could be better." A third simply said, "Thank you for seeing us when we felt invisible." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She quietly pressed every note against her heart, while the room remained respectfully silent. Ethan looked around and realized no annual shareholder meeting, award ceremony, or business achievement had ever carried this kind of meaning. After several moments, the hotel's supervisor stepped forward. His polished uniform looked exactly as it had the first day Ethan secretly watched Grace working, but his voice now carried unmistakable emotion. He admitted that when Grace first accepted the housekeeping position, many employees believed she would leave within days after experiencing the demanding work. Instead, she had inspired dozens of coworkers to volunteer their evenings, donate portions of every paycheck, organize clothing drives, and support families they had never previously known. "She reminded us," he said quietly, "that every uniform represents a human being before it represents a job title." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Grace had transformed not only struggling families but an entire workplace without ever asking anyone to admire her. Finally, the elderly maintenance worker invited Ethan to speak. He hesitated before stepping forward because he knew elegant speeches no longer mattered. Looking around the room, he simply said, "I believed leadership meant making the smartest decisions. Grace showed me that leadership begins by noticing the people our decisions affect. I cannot erase the months when this community carried a burden that belonged to my company, but I promise that we will never again measure success without remembering the faces gathered in this room." No one applauded immediately. Instead, several parents quietly nodded with understanding. In that peaceful silence, Ethan realized forgiveness was not something earned through wealth or promises. It was a gift offered by people whose hearts remained generous even after hardship, and standing beside Grace that evening, he understood that the greatest investment of his life would always be found in the lives they chose to live together. Winter gradually gave way to the first signs of spring, and with every passing week Ethan noticed small changes that no financial report could ever measure. The restored Employee Family Support Fund no longer depended upon the determination of exhausted volunteers working after long shifts because it had become a permanent commitment woven into the culture of Carter Holdings. Every executive meeting now began with a simple question before any discussion of revenue, expansion, or projections. Who will be affected by this decision? At first the question felt unfamiliar inside conference rooms where spreadsheets had always spoken louder than stories, but over time something remarkable happened. Managers visited hotels instead of relying only on reports. Executives met housekeepers, cooks, maintenance workers, and front desk employees whose lives formed the true foundation of every successful property. Policies became more thoughtful because the people writing them finally understood the people living with them. Grace quietly returned to the community center each week, although everyone insisted she spend more time resting as the baby's arrival drew closer. She no longer carried the burden alone because dozens of new volunteers had stepped forward after witnessing her. Example: the elderly maintenance worker now coordinated transportation schedules. The young bell attendant organized weekend food collections. Even the former hotel supervisor devoted his evenings to mentoring employees facing family emergencies. Grace smiled as she watched others discover that compassion grows strongest when it is shared instead of carried by one person. One afternoon, Ethan joined her at the community center after finishing an early board meeting. The little girl who had once drawn colorful pictures ran across the room holding another piece of paper. This time the drawing showed a baby wrapped in a blue blanket surrounded by smiling volunteers beneath a bright sun. Across the top she had carefully written, "Your baby already has a very big family." Grace laughed softly while Ethan felt his eyes fill with gratitude once again. He carefully pinned the drawing onto the bulletin board beside the older pictures, knowing it belonged there among the stories that had transformed both of their lives. Before leaving that evening, Grace unlocked the familiar cabinet one final time. Inside rested the worn notebook, the manila folder, and the growing collection of handwritten letters tied together with the same pale blue ribbon. She gently placed the newest notes beside the others before closing the cabinet. Ethan looked at the folder that had once represented mystery, misunderstanding, and regret. Now it represented something entirely different. It reminded him that the smallest forgotten decision could shape countless lives, but it also proved that one person's quiet kindness could inspire an entire community to choose hope instead of indifference. As they walked home beneath the gentle glow of the city lights, Ethan reached for Grace's hand and silently thanked the ordinary afternoon that had forced him to see the extraordinary woman who had been standing beside him all along. Several months later, the first cool breeze of autumn drifted through Manhattan as Ethan carried his infant son through the front doors of the same neighborhood community center where his life had quietly changed forever. Grace walked beside him, healthy and smiling, gently. Holding a small diaper bag instead of the worn canvas bag she had once carried after long housekeeping shifts. The familiar building looked much the same, but something inside it had transformed. Shelves that had once stood half empty were now fully stocked with groceries, baby supplies, blankets, and medicine. Volunteers greeted new families with calm confidence because they no longer worried whether resources would run out before the end of each month. Children laughed around the same folding tables where fear had once lingered in silence. The little girl who had given Grace so many drawings rushed toward them carrying another colorful picture, this time showing a smiling baby surrounded by dozens of familiar faces. Across the top she had carefully written, "Kindness keeps growing." Grace knelt slowly and thanked her with the same warmth she had shown from the very beginning. Ethan looked around the room and recognized many of the people whose letters had once filled the worn manila folder. The young father now worked full-time again. The elderly maintenance worker proudly introduced everyone to his recovering wife. The little boy wrapped in blankets months earlier ran across the room laughing as he chased a toy airplane. Their victories were not dramatic headlines. They were quiet reminders that hope often returns one ordinary day at a time. Before everyone gathered for lunch, The elderly volunteer who had welcomed Grace on her first evening stepped forward carrying a simple wooden memory box. She handed it to Ethan and Grace with gentle hands. Inside rested the pale blue ribbon, copies of several handwritten letters, the child's first drawing, and a small brass key. Grace recognized it immediately. It was the key to the cabinet where she had protected every story during the months when almost nobody knew what she was doing. The volunteer smiled warmly and said, "The cabinet belongs to everyone now. The key belongs to your family because you reminded all of us that compassion is not locked inside one room. It belongs wherever people choose to carry it." Ethan quietly closed the box and looked at his son sleeping peacefully in his arms. Months earlier he believed the greatest inheritance he could leave his child would be successful companies, investments, and financial security. Now he understood those things were only tools. Character, humility, and the courage to notice people who felt invisible were the treasures that truly lasted from one generation to the next. As the afternoon sunlight filled the room, Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's, and together they watched volunteers welcome another family through the front door with the same kindness that had once welcomed them into a completely different understanding of life. The polished towers of the city still reached high above the skyline, but Ethan no longer measured greatness by the height of buildings or the size of fortunes. He measured it by every life lifted through quiet compassion, every burden shared before anyone asked for help, and every ordinary person willing to become the answer to someone else's prayer. In the end, the most valuable fortune they would ever build was never held inside a bank account. It was carried inside grateful hearts that continued passing kindness forward long after the original gift had been given.